Hello, everyone. On the inspiring word today, I want to talk about the seven feasts of God and their origins. I do believe that the more we understand God's words, is the more we'll understand God's plan for our lives. Now, the seven feasts of God recorded in Leviticus 23 were designed by God to be observed by the children of Israel as three pilgrimage feasts each year. Now, the first pilgrimage feast was called the Feast of Unleavened Bread or the Feast of Passover. And this is held in the month of Abib or Nisan, which is equivalent to our March or April. It consists of the three feasts, which are Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Feast of First Fruit. Next, we have the second pilgrimage feast, which is called the Feast of Harvest. This is actually the fourth feast, also known as the Feast of Weeks, or what we know today as the Feast of Pentecost. This is held in the month of Sivan, or in late spring, which is our June or May. The third and final pilgrimage feast is called the Feast of Ingathering, which is held at the ending of summer. Here the final three feasts are held in the month of Tishri, which is similar to our September-October. These are the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. These three pilgrimage feasts were first mentioned in Exodus chapter 23, verse 14 to 16, and Exodus chapter 34, verses 18, 22, and 23. Now here's an illustration of how God designed the seven feasts to be celebrated in three special months of the year so that his people can all gather in one place to worship God. These three pilgrimage feasts were also harvest celebrations spanning from spring to the ending of summer. So the Passover feast in Nisan would actually be the start of the barley harvest, which lasted until mid-spring, where the second pilgrimage feast in Sivan would be the feast of harvest, or what we call Pentecost. Pentecost is the start of the wheat harvest, which also, similar to barley harvest, lasts for another 2 months, right? And then the summer fruits will begin to be harvested. And at the ending of summer, the closing of the harvest will be celebrated by the fall feast, which is the Feast of Ingathering in the month of Tishri. Now let's move from the Leviticus 23 model of the seven feasts of God and go back to Exodus, where the feast really originated. The Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Feast of First Fruit were all based on events that happened in Egypt's bondage, where God delivered them with his mighty hand and brought them out and through the Red Sea. This can be found in Exodus chapter 12 to chapter 14. Here a spotless lamb was selected and slain, and the blood placed on the door and the lintel for protection, for coverage, because the angel of death would pass over Egypt, and all those who were found under the blood would be spared. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had no choice but to let God's children go. So they went out with their unleavened bread because they had no time to prepare the dough. And they journeyed to the Red Sea, where God miraculously parted the waters so they crossed to the other side. It is believed that the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea by the children of Israel, along with the destruction of the Egyptians who drowned in the Red Sea, is celebrated on the Feast of First Fruits. These events took place in the month of Abib, or early spring, otherwise called Nisan, which is our March or April. From there, they journeyed through the wilderness to Mount Sinai, where they met with God in the month of Sivan, which is equivalent to our May or June. This event is found in Exodus chapter 19, where Moses went back and forth between God and the children of Israel to establish the covenant. Moses became mediator between God and his children regarding the covenant. He was asked to prepare the people for 2 days in sanctification, and on the third day, God would come down on the mountain and would speak with them. On that day, Moses was not supposed to come up to the mountain until the trumpet sounded long and called him up. Sure enough, trumpets were sounding on that day of Pentecost, and Moses went up at the sound of the long sounding trumpet. He received the laws, wrote them down in his book, came and rehearsed them before the people, and then he went back to receive the laws on stone tablets. Here he spent 40 days with the Lord. But something happened causing Moses to leave the presence of God and come down to the camp of the Israelites. They had sinned, committing idolatry and adultery, causing Moses to throw down the laws, breaking the 2 tablets. Here, God destroyed 3,000 of the Israelites, and so Moses had to make atonement for those who were left behind. Now, just before Moses went back to Mount Sinai to replace the 2 tablets that he had broken, he erected a tabernacle of the congregation outside of the camp to signify that God's presence was no longer among his people. So if the people wanted to meet with God or be judged or have a matter to take to the Lord, they would have to leave the camp and go outside to the tabernacle to meet with God there. Joshua was the one who stayed in that tabernacle while Moses went back up to the mountain with God. The events surrounding the atonement period is found in Exodus chapter 32 to 34. Moses now had to go back to Mount Sinai to be with God another 40 days to get the second tablet, the replacement tablets. And there he also got instructions for the tabernacle. And when he returned, construction started on the tabernacle. It was eventually completed in the month of Abib of the next year, in early spring, where it was erected in the midst of God's people, in the midst of the camp, signifying that God's presence was with his people once more. Now, my friends, did you notice any difference between the origins of the feast in Exodus versus the feast in Leviticus 23? Yes, indeed, there's a huge difference in the 3 last feasts: the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. In the origins in Exodus, you will notice that there are no feast events in the 7th month. But here in Leviticus 23, God placed the 3 feasts to be celebrated in the 7th month called Tishri. Let's look at the adjustment God made to the calendar. He intentionally separated Pentecost and the Feast of Trumpets. What he did was to switch the Feast of Trumpets from Sivan, from Pentecost, and cause it to be celebrated in the month of Tishri, the 7th month, along with the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Tabernacles. And notice for the Feast of Tabernacles, he also shortened the time, the distance between the Feast of Trumpets and Tabernacles. So instead of a 9-month span, the Lord caused the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacle to be celebrated all in 1 month. Now, I'm sure you must be curious as to why God shifted the Feast of Trumpets from the 3rd month down to the end of the harvest. And also, why did God move up the Feast of Tabernacle and shorten the time span between the Feast of Trumpets and Tabernacle? Well, I'm sure the answer will come to you once you know the significance of these feasts? Well, hopefully in the next lesson, where I'll explain the significance of the 7 feasts of God, the answer to this question will become much clearer to you. So until next time, God bless you richly.